You're listening to WADR LP 103.5 FM, Janesville, Wisconsin. And now, let's settle in to listen to Gail Poole in Holmes' World.
Excellent, Watson, excellent.
The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
Well, here it is at Holmes' World again. I live there. You're invited to visit and even join if you want. My name is Gail Lang Poole, and I am a Sherlockian. I belong to a group here in Janesville called the Original Tree Worshippers of Rock County. We meet at the Hedberg Public Library once a month, and it's free. We talk about Sherlock Holmes. We have some fun. So, now, here on the radio show, I'm going to introduce you to Holmes and his adventures. If you want any credentials, I've written a book called Sherlock Holmes and the Folktale Mysteries, Volume 1. It won the Janesville Area Creative Awards for 2016 this January. And I got a nice statuette, and it was cool. So I guess you could say I'm an award-winning author. I'm not going to try and say that too often. I just got back from New York City. Every January, they have a weekend for Sherlock Holmes. It's put on by the Baker Street Irregulars, which is a national group based in New York City. There are a lot of gatherings and parties, and there's a formal dinner to which you must be invited. So I didn't go to that. But I went to a fun party at the same time, and I went to several different things that are held during the weekend, and it's a lot of fun. This is my 7th time going. So today we're going... Well, what is it, Ducky? Okay, it's sure Ducky, my little co-host here. He's a little rubber duck that looks like Sherlock Holmes, if Sherlock Holmes looked like a little rubber duck. And he says we should get on the road with this. So, the story today is The Adventure of the Speckled Band. This was written by Arthur Conan Doyle and published in the Strand magazine in, I believe it was January of 1892. In the middle of his contract with the Strand magazine to write a number of short stories featuring Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. The stories became immensely popular the first time they were printed in the Strand. And it's one of the reasons that we still like Sherlock Holmes today. The stories made him so available to the general public. Now, The Adventure of the Speckled Band. This is a shortened version. It was early in April in the year 83 that I woke one morning to find Sherlock Holmes standing fully dressed at the side of my bed. I blinked up at him in some surprise. "Very sorry to knock you up, Watson," he said, "but it's a common lot this morning. Mrs. Hudson has been knocked up," she retorted, "upon me, and I upon you." "What is it, then? A fire?" "No, a client. Should it prove to be an interesting case, you would, I am sure, wish to follow it from the outset. I thought at any rate that I should call you and give you the chance. My dear fellow, I would not miss it for anything." So Watson gets dressed, and they go downstairs. A lady dressed in black and heavily veiled, who'd been sitting in the window, rose as we entered. "Good morning, madam," said Holmes cheerfully. "I am glad to see that Mrs. Hudson has the good sense to light the fire. Please draw up to it, and I shall order you a cup of hot coffee, for I observe that you are shivering." "It is not cold which makes me shiver," said the woman in a low voice, changing her seat as requested. "What is it, then?" "It is fear, Mr. Holmes. It is terror." "You must not fear," he said soothingly, bending forward and patting her forearm. "We shall soon set matters right, I have no doubt." "Sir, I can stand the strain no longer. I shall go mad if it continues. Oh, sir, do you not think that you could help me too, and at least throw a little light through the intense darkness which surrounds me? My name is Helen Stoner, and I'm living with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran. on the western border of Surrey. The family was at one time among the richest in England, and the family ruin was eventually completed by a gambler in the days of the Regency. Nothing was saved except a few acres of ground and the 200-year-old house, which is itself crushed under a heavy mortgage. My stepfather, seeing that he must adapt himself to the new conditions, obtained an advance from a relative which enabled him to take a medical degree, and he went out to Calcutta, where by his professional skill and his force of character he established a large practice. In a fit of anger, however, caused by some robberies which had been perpetrated in the house, he beat his native butler to death and narrowly escaped a capital sentence. As it was, he suffered a long term of imprisonment and afterwards returned to England a morose and disappointed man. When Dr. Roylott was in India, he married my mother, Mrs. Stoner, the young widow of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery. My sister Julia and I were twins, and we were only 2 years old at the time of my mother's remarriage. She had a considerable sum of money, not less than £1,000 a year, and this she bequeathed to Dr. Roylott entirely while we resided with him, with a provision that a certain annual sum should be allowed to each of us in the event of our marriage. Shortly after our return to England, my mother died. Dr. Roylott then abandoned his attempts to establish himself in practice in London and took us to live with him in the old ancestral house in Stoke Moran. But a terrible change came over our stepfather about this time. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbors, he shut himself up in his house and seldom came out save to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whoever might cross his path. A series of disgraceful brawls took place, 2 of which ended in the police court, until at last he became the terror of the village, and the folks would fly at his approach, for he is a man of immense strength and absolutely uncontrollable in his anger. He had no friends at all, save the wandering gypsies, and he would give these vagabonds leave to encamp upon the few acres of bramble-covered land which represent the family estate. He also had strange animals sent from India, and he has at this moment a cheetah and a baboon, which wander freely over his grounds and are feared by the villagers almost as much as their master. My poor sister Julia was but 30 at the time of her death, and yet her hair had already begun to whiten, even as mine has. Your sister is dead, then? She died just 2 years ago, and it is of her death that I wish to speak to you. The manor house, as I have already said, is very old, and only one wing is now inhabited. The bedrooms on this wing are on the ground floor. Of these bedrooms, the first is Dr. Roylott's, the second my sister's, and the third my own. There is no communication between them, but they all open out onto the same corridor. One night my sister came to my room, and we chatted about her approaching wedding. At 11 o'clock she rose to leave me, but she paused at the door and looked back. "Tell me, Helen," she said, "have you ever heard anyone whistle in the dead of night?" "Never," said I. "But why?" "Because during the last few nights I have always about 3 a.m. heard a low, clear whistle. I am a light sleeper, and it has awakened me. I cannot tell where it came from, perhaps from the next room, perhaps from the lawn. I thought that I would just ask you whether you had heard it. No, I have not. It must be those wretched gypsies in the plantation." "Well, it is no great consequence at any rate." She smiled back at me, closed my door, and a few minutes later I heard her key turn in the lock. She was so happy about being engaged to be married. Her whole future seemed bright, and although our life here with Dr. Roylott had been rough, I was happy for her to see her with such a future before her. It was only a few weeks before the wedding when all this occurred. I could not sleep that night. A vague feeling of impending misfortune impressed me. The wind was howling outside, and the rain was beating and splashing against the windows. Suddenly, amid all the hubbub of the gale, there burst forth the wild scream of a terrified woman. I knew it was my sister's voice. I rushed into the corridor. As I opened my door, I seemed to hear a low whistle, such as my sister described, and a few moments later a clanging sound, as if a mass of metal had fallen. As I ran down the passage, my sister's door was unlocked and revolved slowly upon its hinges. By the light of the corridor lamp, I saw my sister appear at the opening. her face blanched with terror, her hands groping for help, her whole figure swaying to and fro like that of a drunkard. I ran to her and threw my arms around her, but at that moment her knees seemed to give way and she fell to the ground. She suddenly shrieked out in a voice which I will never forget, "Oh my God, Helen! It was the band! It was the speckled band!" I rushed out, calling loudly for my stepfather. All his medical efforts were in vain to revive her, for she slowly sank and died without having recovered her consciousness. Such was the dreadful end of my beloved sister. Holmes shook his head like a man who was far from satisfied. "These are very deep waters," he said. "Please go on with your narrative." 2 years have passed, and I have lately become engaged to a second son of Mr. Armitage of Cranewater near Reading. My stepfather has offered no opposition to the match, and we are to be married in the course of the spring. 2 days ago, some repairs were started on the west wing of the building, and my bedroom wall has been pierced, so that I have to move into the chamber in which my sister died, and to sleep in the very bed in which she slept. Imagine, then, my thrill of terror when I suddenly heard in the silence of last night the low whistle which had been the herald of her own death. I was too shaken to go to bed, however, so I dressed, and as soon as it was daylight, I slipped down and drove to Leatherhead, from whence I have come this morning on the train with the one object of seeing you and asking your advice. Holmes considered everything that he had been told. Then he addressed the client. "If we were to come to Stoke Moran today, would it be possible for us to see over these rooms without the knowledge of your stepfather? As it happened, he spoke of coming into town today upon some most important business. It is probable that he will be away all day, and there would be nothing to disturb you. Then you may expect us in the early afternoon. I have myself some small business matters to attend to. Will you not wait and breakfast with us?" "No, I must go. My heart is lightened already since I have confided my trouble to you." And the client left. Holmes was mulling over the information that Miss Stoner had given us when suddenly our door was dashed open and a huge man framed himself in the aperture. A large face, seared with 1,000 wrinkles, burned yellow with the sun, and marked with every evil passion, was turned from one to the other of us, while his deep-set, bile-shot eyes and his high, thin, fleshless nose gave him somewhat the resemblance of a fierce old bird of prey. "Which of you is Holmes?" asked the apparition. "My name, sir, but you have the advantage of me," said my companion quietly. "I am Dr. Grimsby Roylott of Stoke Moran." "Indeed, doctor," said Holmes blandly. "Pray take a seat." "I will do nothing of the kind. My stepdaughter has been here. I have traced her. What has she been saying to you?" "It's a little cold for the time of the year," said Holmes. "What has she been saying to you?" screamed the old man furiously. "But I have heard that the crocuses promise well," continued my companion imperturbably. "Ha! You put me off, do you?" said our new visitor, taking a step forward and shaking his hunting crop. "I know you, you scoundrel. I have heard of you before. You're Holmes, the meddler." My friend smiled. "Holmes, the busybody." His smile broadened. "Holmes, the Scotland Yard jack-in-office." Holmes chuckled heartily. "Your conversation is most entertaining," he said. "When you go close the door, for there is an excited draught. I will go when I have had my say. Don't you dare meddle with my affairs. I know that Miss Stoner has been here. I am a dangerous man to fall foul of. See here." He stepped forward swiftly, seized the poker, and bent it into a curve with his huge brown hands. "See that you keep yourself out of my grip," he snarled, and hurling the twisted poker into the fireplace, he strode out of the room. "He seems a very amiable person," said Holmes, laughing. "If he had remained, I might have showed him that my grip is not much more feeble than his own." As he spoke, he picked up the steel poker and with a sudden effort straightened it out again. "Now, Watson, we shall order breakfast, and afterwards I shall walk down to Doctors' Commons, where I hope to get some data which may help us in this matter." It was nearly 1 o'clock when Holmes returned. "I have seen the will of the deceased wife," he said. "The total income, which at the time of the wife's death was little short of 1,100 pounds, is now, through the fall in agricultural prices, not more than 750 pounds. Each daughter can claim an income of 250 pounds in case of marriage. It is evident, therefore, that if both girls had married, this beauty would have had a mere pittance, while even one of them would have crippled him to a very serious extent. It's time to go to Stoke Moran. At Waterloo, we were fortunate in catching a train for Leatherhead, where we hired a trap at the station and drove for 4 or 5 miles through the lovely Surrey lanes. Our driver told us, if you want to get to the house, you'll find it shorter to go over this stile, and so by the footpath over the fields. There it is, where the lady is walking. And the lady, I fancy, is Miss Stoner, observed Holmes, shading his eyes. Yes, I think we had better do as you suggest. We got off, paid our fare, and the trap rattled back on its way to Leatherhead. Our client of the morning had hurried forward to meet us, with a face which spoke of her joy. I have been waiting so eagerly for you, she cried, shaking hands with us warmly. All has turned out splendidly. Dr. Roylott has gone to town, and it is unlikely that he will be back before evening. And here we'll take a pause for a little music. Holmes, perhaps, on his violin. Oh, now don't be scared, Sherducky. I'll tell you the rest of the story, and then you'll be all right, okay? All right. Holmes and Watson have met Miss Stoner on the grounds of Stoke Moran, her stepfather's ancestral home. All has turned out splendidly, said Miss Stoner. Dr. Roylott has gone to town, and it is unlikely that he will be back before evening. We have had the pleasure of making the doctor's acquaintance, said Holmes. Miss Stoner turned white to the lips as she listened. Good heavens, she cried. He has followed me, then. So it appears. Oh, what will he say when he returns? You must lock yourself up from him tonight. And as you both lock your doors at night, your rooms are unapproachable from that side. We're going to examine your room outside and in and see what we can find out." They went to Stoke Moran over the lawn, and Holmes closely examined the window. "Now, would you have the kindness, Miss Stoner, to go into your room and bar your shutters?" Miss Stoner did so, and Holmes, after a careful examination through the open window, endeavored in every way to force the shutter open, but without success. You have to understand, listeners, that shutters in English homes closed from the inside and folded back when they were open into the wall. Therefore, she could close the shutters and they still have the glass protecting her from whatever was outside, although those windows may not be locked and could be easily opened. To get through the shutter was the way to get into the room. "No one could pass these shutters if they were bolted," said Holmes. "Let's see if the inside throws any light upon the matter." We passed at once to the second room, that in which Miss Stoner was now sleeping, and in which her sister had met her fate. A brown chest of drawers stood in one corner, a narrow white counterpaned bed in another, and a dressing table on the left-hand side of the window. "What does that bell communicate with?" he asked at last, pointing to a thick bell rope which hung down beside the bed, the tassel actually lying upon the pillow. "It goes to the housekeeper's room. It looks newer than the other things." "Yes, it was only put there a couple of years ago." "Your sister asked for it, I suppose?" "No, I never heard of her using it. We used also always to get what we wanted for ourselves." "You will excuse me," said Holmes, "for a few minutes while I satisfy myself as to this floor." He threw himself down upon his face with his lens in his hand and crawled swiftly backwards and forwards, examining minutely the cracks between the boards. Finally, he took the bell rope in his hand and gave it a brisk tug. "Why, it's a dummy," said he. "Won't it ring?" "No, it's not even attached to a wire. This is very interesting. You can see now that it is fastened to a hook, just above where the little opening for the ventilator is." "That is also quite modern," said the lady. "Done about the same time as the bell rope?" remarked Holmes. "Yes, there were several little changes carried out about that time." "They seem to have been of a most interesting character. Dummy bell ropes and ventilators which do not ventilate." "With your permission, Miss Stoner, we shall now carry our researches into the inner apartment." Dr. Grimsby Roylott's chamber was larger than that of his stepdaughter, but was as plainly furnished. A camp bed, an armchair beside the bed, a plain wooden chair against the wall, a round table, and a large iron safe were the principal things which met the eye. The ventilator was up near the ceiling against one wall that faced the wall of the bedroom Miss Stoner was using. Holmes walked slowly around and examined each and all of them with the keenest interest. "What's in here?" he asked, tapping the safe. "My stepfather's business papers." "Thank you, that is quite settled," he said. "Hello, here's something interesting." The object which had caught his eye was a small dog lash, hung in one corner of the bed. The lash, however, was curled upon itself and tied so to make a loop of whipcord. "What do you make of that, Watson?" "It's a common enough lash, but I don't know why it should be tied." "That is not quite so common, is it? Ah, me. It's a wicked world, and when a clever man turns his brains to crime, it is the worst of all. I think that I have seen enough now, Miss Stoner, and with your permission we shall walk out upon the lawn." "It is very essential, Miss Stoner," said Holmes, "that you should absolutely follow my advice in every respect. In the first place, both my friend and I must spend the night in your room. You must confine yourself to your old room, on pretense of a headache, when your stepfather comes back. Then when you hear him retire for the night, you must open the shutters of your window, undo the hasp, put your lamp there as a signal to us, and then withdraw quietly with everything you are likely to want into the room which you used to occupy. The rest you could leave in our hands." She agreed. When her stepfather would return, she would go to her current bedroom, and then later set the lamp in the window and retreat to her old bedroom. Sherlock Holmes and I had no difficulty in engaging a bedroom and sitting room at the Crown Inn. They were on the upper floor, and from our window we could command a view of the Avenue Gate and of the inhabited wing of Stoke Moran Manor House. Holmes brought out his pipe and started going over some of the clues that he'd found that day. "Did you observe anything very peculiar about that bed, Watson?" "No." "It was clamped to the floor. Did you ever see a bed fastened like that before?" "I cannot say I have." "The lady could not move her bed. It must always be in the same relative position to the ventilator and to the rope, or so we may call it, since it was clearly never meant for a bell pull." "Holmes," I cried, "I seem to see dimly what you are hinting at. We are only just in time to prevent some subtle and horrible crime." "Subtle enough and horrible enough. When a doctor does go wrong, he is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge." About 9 o'clock, the light among the trees was extinguished, and all was dark in the direction of the manor house. 2 hours passed slowly away, and then, suddenly, just at the stroke of 11, a single bright light shone out right in front of us. "That is our signal," said Holmes, springing to his feet. "It comes from the middle window." I followed Holmes' example as we approached the house and slipped off my shoes. We climbed through the window into Miss Stoner's bedroom. Creeping up to me and making a trumpet of his hand, Holmes whispered into my ear again so gently that it was all I could do to distinguish the words. "The least sound would be fatal to our plans." I nodded to show I had heard. "We must sit without light. He would see it through the ventilator." I nodded again. "Do not go asleep. Your very life may depend upon it. Have your pistol ready in case we should need it. I will sit on the bed, and you in that chair." I took out my revolver and laid it on the corner of the table. Holmes had brought up a long, thin cane, and this he placed upon the bed beside him. By it he laid the box of matches and the stump of a candle. Then he turned down the lamp, and we were left in darkness. For half an hour I sat with straining ears, and then suddenly another sound became audible, a very gentle, soothing sound, like that of a small jet of steam escaping continuously from a kettle. The instant that we heard it, Holmes sprang from the bed, struck a match, and lashed furiously with his cane at the bell pull. "You see it, Watson?" he yelled. "You see it?" But I saw nothing. At the moment when Holmes struck the light, I heard a low, clear whistle, but the sudden glare flashing into my weary eyes made it impossible for me to tell what it was at which my friend lashed so savagely. I could, however, see that his face was deadly pale and filled with horror and loathing. He had ceased to strike and was gazing up at the ventilator when suddenly there broke from the silence of the night the most horrible cry in which I have ever listened. It swelled up louder and louder, a hoarse yell of pain and fear and anger, all mingled into one dreadful shriek. Holmes and I stared at each other, struck cold to our hearts, and until the last echoes of it died away into the silence from which it rose. "What can it mean?" I gasped. "It means it's all over," Holmes answered, "and perhaps, after all, it is for the best. Take your pistol, and we will enter Dr. Roylott's room." It was a singular sight which met our eyes. On the table stood a dark lantern with the shutter half open, throwing a brilliant beam of light upon the iron safe, the door of which was ajar. Beside this table, on the wooden chair, sat Dr. Grimsby Roylott, clad in a long gray dressing gown, his bare ankles protruding beneath, and his feet thrust into red heelless Turkish slippers. Across his lap lay the short stock with the long lash, which we had noticed during the day. His chin was cocked upward, and his eyes were fixed in a dreadful, rigid stare at the corner of the ceiling. Around his brow he had a peculiar yellow band with brownish speckles, which seemed to be bound tightly around his head. As we entered, he made neither sound nor motion. The "A speckled band," whispered Holmes. I took a step forward. In an instant, his strange headgear began to move, and there reared itself from among his hair the squat, diamond-shaped head and puff neck of a loathsome serpent. "It is a swamp adder," cried Holmes, "the deadliest snake in India. He has died within 10 seconds of being bitten. Violence does, in truth, recoil upon the violent, and the schemer falls into the pit which he digs for another." As he spoke, he drew the dog whip swiftly from the dead man's lap, and throwing the noose around the reptile's neck, he drew it from his horrid perch, and carrying it at arm's length, threw it into the iron safe, which he closed upon it. "We must remove Miss Stoner to some place of shelter, and let the county police know what has happened." The slow process of official inquiry came to the conclusion that the doctor met his fate while indiscreetly playing with a dangerous pet. The little which I had yet to learn of the case was told to me by Sherlock Holmes as we traveled back the next day. "I had come to some conclusions before I had ever entered his room," said Holmes. "An inspection of his chair showed me that he had been in the habit of standing on it, which of course would be necessary in order that he should reach the ventilator. The metallic clang heard by Miss Stoner was obviously called by her stepfather, hastily closing the door of his safe upon its terrible occupant. I heard the creature hiss, as I have no doubt that you did also, and I instantly lit the light and attacked it, with the result of driving it through the ventilator, and also with the result of causing it to turn upon its master at the other side. Some of the blows of my cane came home and roused its snakish temper, so that it flew upon the first person it saw. In this way, I am no doubt indirectly responsible for Dr. Grimsby Roylott's death, and I cannot say that it is likely to weigh very heavily upon my conscience." Well, what do you think, Sherducky? Yes, it was a very scary story, but it was a very good story, too. During a visit to South Africa in 1900, Conan Doyle was asked by a journalist if he could name his favorite home story. "Perhaps the one about the serpent," he replied. It was easy to see why he chose The Adventure of the Speckled Band. It contained all the classic ingredients of a great detective story: a dastardly villain, a seemingly inexplicable death in a locked room, a young lady in great distress, moments of real danger, and an injection of exotic and foreign otherness, and some inspired and brilliant sleuthing. So it's become your favorite. Thank you, Sherducky. It was a favorite of a lot of people. This was one of the plays that Arthur Conan Doyle put into stage form later on, and it performed very, very brilliantly on the London stage, and then later went out on tour in England. I think it even toured America. They had a mechanical snake. Well, they tried with a real snake, but it wouldn't obey the directions, and frankly, the stagehands were scared of it. So they got a mechanical snake, and it became practically the star of the show. It was even made into a movie, I think during the 1930s, with Arthur Wantner. And I think there was a silent version with Ellie Norwood also playing Holmes. So it's been of course it's been anthologized on television a lot of times. Jeremy Brett did a version. Douglas Wilmer did a very effective version for their respective television shows off the BBC. And you can see, anything that scary, it would make a great show. And everything happens in the dark. And ooh. So there's been much speculation about the species of the snake in the story. Holmes identifies it as a swamp adder, the deadliest snake in India. But this name is one of Conan Doyle's inventions. Some commentators have decided it must be an Indian cobra, since this matches the description of a reptile with a diamond-shaped head and puffed neck. The Indian cobra's poison is suitably fast-acting, too. It blocks the transmission of nerve signals at the synapses and can cause paralysis and heart failure, often within an hour, but sometimes in just 15 minutes. It is the species most commonly used by India's snake charmers, too. And votays worship live snakes during times of the year, and they are fed milk, which may have been where Roylott got the idea to reward his snake. However, since snakes are not mammals, they cannot digest milk, and it is harmful to them. Maybe that's one reason the snake got so ticked off. Here he was fed this dreadful diet, and then somebody started hitting him with a cane. So, that is the adventure of the speckled band. Now, we're going to hear a little bit more music, and then I've got some reviews that I want to go over with you. Well, wasn't that nice music? Okay. I want to give a kudo to the Sherlock Holmes book, Big Ideas Simply Explained, which is printed by DK, which is a section of Penguin Random House. It's locally available, and its consultant editor is David Stewart Davies, who is a prominent Sherlockian and definitely knows what he's writing about. Now, that had the notes on the snake that I read earlier. So it's a wonderful book, and it's very nice reference books for people who are interested in Sherlock Holmes. Now, I've got a couple of book reviews here. The first one is called A Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes by Professor Marino C. Alvarez. This is published by MK Publishing. And I reviewed this. A seasoned Sherlock Holmes expert, Marino C. Alvarez, shows how the great game is played by the best. The Sherlockian Great Game of Oxford was founded in 1911 when the Reverend Ronald Knox of Oxford published a paper treating the existing Holmes stories as serious scholarship. Since then, thousands of papers, articles, and books have been published on the subject of Holmes, Watson, and their adventures by many people. Here, in A Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes, Professor Alvarez goes into some classic questions, such as exactly what was the physical layout of 221B Baker Street, and how Sherlock Holmes's scientific methods are still effective today in criminal investigations. A member of several Sherlockian scions, including the Nashville Scholars of the Three-Pipe Problem and the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, Professor Alvarez absolutely knows his stuff on the subject of Sherlock Holmes and his world. If you want fine examples of Sherlockian scholarship, get A Professor Reflects on Sherlock Holmes. Just don't expect an easy course. This professor does not grade on a curve. All right. Another fun book is a pastiche called Mrs. Hudson in New York by Barry S. Brown. The canon of Sherlock Holmes stories says that Mrs. Hudson was the housekeeper/landlady of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson of 221B Baker Street. In the tale told by Barry S. Brown, she is the widow of a London policeman. Her husband taught her all the observations and deductions later attributed to Sherlock Holmes. These she taught to her lodgers, Holmes and Watson. Thus was formed a partnership that revolutionized Victorian crime fighting. Since it was during an era when women didn't have public careers, Mrs. Hudson kept her talents in the background. Sherlock Holmes became the great detective, while Mrs. Hudson remained unknown and nearly unsung. In this adventure, Mrs. Hudson in New York, Mrs. Hudson, Dr. Watson, and Sherlock Holmes traveled to 1890s New York City for Mrs. Hudson to attend her cousin's daughter's wedding to an American baseball player. Imagine her distress to find as soon as they got off the ship that an attempt had been made on the life of Mr. Piermont J. Morgan. His assistant was killed, and the ball player was the chief suspect. Infused through and through with details and atmosphere of the era, join Mrs. Hudson, Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. Watson as they investigate the upper levels of society and the lower depths of American society to solve the Morgan case and reunite the lovebirds for a happy ending. This is a pastiche, and it goes a bit outside of the normal Holmes-Watson universe. But there are a lot of pastiches like that. There are pastiches that are set in outer space. There are pastiches set in the far future. There are stories that are set in America when it is not noted in the original canon that Holmes came to America. He's actually been active in the pastiche world all over the world, including South America, Japan, Asia, and in the African world also, besides Europe and America. So if you get into Sherlock Holmes pastiches, you can find almost anything, almost anywhere. I really recommend, however, that you first read the original 60 stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, because that establishes a base from which you can explore. And the stories themselves, in that case, are extremely interesting. Now, Holmes has not only appeared in print by others than Conan Doyle. It was very popular to make movies. In fact, he appeared in silent movies sanctioned by Conan Doyle while Doyle was still alive. There's a series called The Stowell Pictures, which starred Ellie Norwood, who was an actor, and he was famous for the disguises that he would put on film. Although the movies were silent, they were full of action, they were clearly captioned. I would like to tell you about Sherlock Holmes, a film that came out in 2009. It was directed by Guy Ritchie, who was best known for his Cockney crime movies. It was a tongue-in-cheek rebooting of the Holmes genre that sees the detective transformed into a Hollywood-style action hero. Set in Victorian London, it is a non-canonical tale with Holmes and Watson played by Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law. The plot, which has elements of science fiction and the supernatural, sees the detective pair form an unlikely alliance with former enemy Irene Adler. Together they must first save Britain, the U.S., and then the whole world from the late Lord Blackwood, recently raised from the dead. At the end, Adler reveals her connections to Moriarty, opening the prospect of a sequel, which did show up in 2011. Now, this was a movie that came out in 2009, and it really kicked more life into the Sherlock Holmes genre. Robert Downey Jr. really doesn't look that much as my concept of Sherlock Holmes, but he had the backing, and you got to go where the money goes. Now, Jude Law, on the other hand, is, I think, very handsome and makes an excellent Watson. And the movie was enjoyable. It was certainly action-filled. And it had some iconic shots of London, including the Tower Bridge, which was being built at the time the movie was set in 1895. So, those are a couple of things that maybe you can pick up somewhere. There's actually a cartoon series out called Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century. It used to play on television. It is available on DVD. I have one called Out of This World, and it has colorful characters, detailed landscape, and delightful, unbelievable mysteries make this a series to watch. That is a eopinions.com review. They did something interesting. They took Holmes into the future in an animated form, and then they had him in adventures that if you were paying attention, you could pick out the Conan Doyle story that they were related to. London in the 22nd century is experiencing an unprecedented crime wave orchestrated by a criminal mastermind from the past, Dr. James Moriarty. To combat this, New Scotland Yard brings Sherlock Holmes back to life, and with the help of Beth Lestrade and a robotic Dr. Watson, he will attempt to restore peace. He has, in this DVD, are 4 adventures. I'll tell you about one of them. The Sign of 4. Holmes must accompany a troubled young woman to the moon to solve a 20-year-old mystery. So they really use the future in these stories. They did well on the voices. They did well on the animation. And as long as you remember it's the 22nd century and don't expect Holmes to show up in a hansom cab, this is a really good series, and I like it. There are multiple DVDs that you can get of Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century. So I would think that would be something that perhaps you would like to look up. I think, what do you think, Sherducky? Well, I know you like the animation, the cartoon stuff. Yeah, you just wish that you could work the DVR player, don't you, so you could play more when I'm out? Okay, well, now I'll know. I'll have to keep an eye on you now. I think that the one of the great human actors who ever did the Speckled Band was during a TV show the BBC put out in I think it was 64. The classic BBC run of Sherlock Holmes starring Douglas Wilmer is finally available on DVD. Now, Douglas Wilmer was an English actor. He is still alive. Yes, really. He's very old, but he's still alive. And in fact, have you heard of the television show from the BBC called Sherlock? Yes, it's the modern one. They've only had about 9 episodes came out, and then they had the Christmas thing in January, which I really enjoyed. Oh, you did too. Good. Well, he was in one of the earlier episodes when Holmes is missing or Watson has a problem that he really has to talk to Mycroft about. He goes to Mycroft's club, the Diogenes Club. And there's a rule there that you cannot talk except in a special room. Well, Watson barges right in and starts stomping around and saying, "Where is Mycroft? I've got to talk to Mycroft." And there's this old member in the corner in a armchair who gets very upset because Watson is talking. And finally, someone comes and leads Watson away to Mycroft. Well, the old member in the chair at the Diogenes Club was Douglas Wilmer. So he has been in the most modern of the Sherlock Holmes BBC episodes also. Yes, that's very nice. Well, back in the 1960s, he did a whole series of BBC commissioned episodes with Douglas Wilmer as Holmes and Nigel Stock as his faithful friend, Dr. Watson. This DVD, never before released, includes some of the best stories from the canon. They have the Copper Beeches, or they have the Red-Headed League. They also have the Speckled Band. And, chasing snakes, that can be dangerous. You would not like to chase snakes? But you look like Sherlock Holmes. Oh, you are the Sherlock Holmes who sits in a hansom cab and the Sherlock Holmes who stays home in front of the fire and does all the deducing in your head. Okay, well, as long as we understand that, I will not send you out after any snakes. Well, you're welcome. Okay. Well, people, it's getting toward the end, and I'm certainly glad that you tuned me in today, and I hope that you've enjoyed our program today. Sherlock Holmes is a wonderful subject because it has so much depth, it has so many layers. It covers a fascinating time period in British history where they still had the empire, but dark clouds were gathering on the horizon because of things happening in Europe. And it's a fascinating subject. You can go into so many levels. What did they eat? How did they travel? Where were the train stations? Where did they go? What kind of architecture did they have? Did the girl always turn out innocent? We have to read all the stories to find out. There are a couple who didn't. So I really encourage you to get hold of some Sherlock Holmes stories that are widely available. And, join me in these weekly episodes because it's Sherlock Holmes's world. So join me and Sherducky next week for another Sherlock Holmes adventure and a little more of a glimpse into Holmes' world.
That's it for this week. Join Gail Poole again next week for another adventure in Holmes' world.
Why have you come to see me?
I'd have thought that was obvious, Doctor. We have a case for Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
To the home of Sherlock Holmes, lady boy, the name of Jones, came one day, strange to say, said her husband disappeared, a victim of a plot she feared.
At the rent, when he went, won't you find him for me, Mr. Holmes?
Oh, she cried out to him in sobbing tones.
You can have most everything I owns if you will bring him back. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I'll give 1,000 bones if you can find my loving man. This is his description. He isn't tall and he isn't small. He's about as big as that. He wears a derby hat. He answers to the name of Jones. Oh, won't you please, please, please hear my tones? Go out and find him, Sherlock Holmes.
Watson, get the needle quick. I got a job and must be slick. I'll land this man if we can. Took a trip to Scotland Yard. Found her husband playing cards.
Quite content, rent had went. Sherlock said we're on the proper trail.
Oh, we'll succeed, I'm sure, if we don't fail. When he said, I'll get you out on bail, Jones sang, don't take me home.
Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I'll give 1,000 bones if you could find my loving man. This is his description. He isn't tall and he isn't small. He's about as big as that. He wears a derby hat. He answers to the name of Jones. Oh, won't you please, please, please hear my tones? Go out and find him, Sherlock Holmes.
Most unusual, Watson. Most unusual.
What's most unusual, Watson?
The London criminal is certainly a dull fellow.
What makes you say that?
Well, look out of the window. Ideal weather for committing a crime.